The clinking of silver against fine porcelain was a melody in itself, a symphony of privilege echoing through the sun-drenched courtyard of La Lanterne Dorée. Light laughter and conversations about stock markets and trips to the Alps floated on the air, mingling with the aroma of truffles and expensive wine. It was in this meticulously curated setting of opulence that a simple question, uttered in an almost inaudible voice, cut through the atmosphere like a dissonant note. "Excuse me, can I play for food?" The voice belonged to Alva Szymanski-Baker, a 17-year-old whose entire world seemed contained within the worn saxophone case she clutched with both hands, as if it were an anchor in a stormy sea. Beside her, her 20-year-old older brother, Matteo Youn, maintained a protective stance, his tense face etched with anticipated humiliation. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but at the restaurant manager, an impeccably dressed man named Emre Esposito, who approached with a look that blended impatience and disdain. Emre stopped, a smirk slowly forming on his lips. He glanced at the girl, at her simple clothes, at the way her eyes avoided direct contact, focusing on an abstract point just above his shoulder. He looked at her brother, whose expression of despair was almost palpable, and then he laughed. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh, but something far worse, a low, controlled, and deeply mocking sound that drew the attention of nearby tables. "Play?" he repeated, savoring the word as if it were cheap wine. "Darling, people pay to not hear street noise. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're spoiling my customer's view." Alva was only 17, and while the concept of time and social expectations was often a labyrinth for her, she never imagined that the instrument her father had given her, the only voice she felt she truly possessed, would be met with such disdain. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Her fingers merely tightened their grip on the battered velvet case. Inside her, a strange calm settled, a serenity that exists only in those who have faced far worse storms and survived to tell the tale. Matteo, on the other hand, felt the blood rush to his face. "Sir, please, she's very good. We just need something to eat. Anything." The plea in his voice only fueled Emre's arrogance. "I'm sure she is," the manager said, now speaking loud enough for several customers to hear, turning the moment into a cruel spectacle. Jacob Popescu, an investor seated with his wife, Sofia Farhadi, shook his head in disapproval, not at the manager, but at the young people on the sidewalk. "What audacity," Sofia murmured, "to come begging for handouts in a place like this." Humiliation was a slowly spreading poison. Alva, however, seemed to be elsewhere. Her focus was singular. She had seen that look on other people before. It was the same look from the landlord, Adam Svoboda, 2 weeks prior, when he'd thrown them out of the small apartment they lived in. A quick, painful flashback flooded Matteo's mind. The door opening, Adam's cold expression, their few possessions piled on the sidewalk under a gray sky. "The rent is 3 months late, Matteo, I warned you. I can't run a charity shelter," the man had said, ignoring his pleas. He remembered how Alva had simply gone to her room, picked up the saxophone, and stood in the middle of the room, as if expecting music to somehow reverse the inevitable. Another fragment. The social worker at school, Sergei Fisher, looking at Alva with a mixture of pity and frustration. "She has interaction difficulties, Matteo. The autism spectrum manifests in complex ways. Perhaps a more structured environment would be better for her." The veiled suggestion of separating them had hung in the air since their parents died in a car accident a year earlier. Matteo refused to let that happen. He had promised to take care of her, and Alva's saxophone, their father's last gift, was the center of her universe. It was the only thing that kept her anchored, the only language in which she was fluent, eloquent, brilliant. Emre Esposito snapped his fingers, signaling a burly security guard. "Didier Nguyen. Didier, please escort our artists off the premises. They are disturbing the peace." As the security guard approached, Alva finally lifted her gaze and fixed it on Emre. There was no fear or pleading in her eyes. There was only silent observation, a deep analysis that seemed to disarm the manager for a millisecond. It was as if she didn't see him as a threat but as a curiosity, a complex and unpleasant mathematical equation she was solving in her mind. "You don't need to kick us out," Matteo said, his voice thick with contained anger. He took Alva's hand. "We're going." He cast one last look at Emre. "You don't know what you're missing." The phrase came out almost as a whisper, but laden with a conviction that intrigued one of the few patrons observing the scene. With something other than contempt, Iglesias, a renowned jazz critic dining alone in a discreet corner, frowned. There was something in the girl's posture, in the way she protected that instrument, that sparked his professional curiosity. He saw Emre's disdain, the public humiliation, but he also saw the unshakable dignity of that silent young woman. As Matteo pulled Alva away from the warm light of the restaurant and back into the cold darkness of the street, Emre Esposito returned inside, receiving a nod of approval from some of his more affluent patrons. He felt victorious, the guardian of exclusivity, the protector of order. Little did he know, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had judged the book by its cover, the musician by her silence, and was about to discover that some melodies, once unleashed, have the power to bring down empires. There, before all the scornful gazes, Alva stood firm, like one guarding a secret too powerful to reveal before its time. The night's chill was cutting, but it paled in comparison to the coldness emanating from that restaurant. To everyone there, it was just another unpleasant incident, another pair of beggars being chased away. But for Alva and Matteo, that moment of humiliation would become the catalyst for a revolution no one would ever forget. If you've ever felt judged or underestimated, you know that strength often hides where no one expects to find it. Keep watching to discover how a girl's silence was about to become the loudest, most powerful sound that city had ever heard. The door to La Lanterne Dorée closed behind them, muffling the sound of laughter and ambient music, leaving Alva and Matteo plunged into the hostile silence of the street. Matteo's stomach growled, a miserable symphony mocking the music he'd hoped his sister could play. The humiliation still burned on his cheeks, a shameful heat that contrasted with the night's cold. He kicked an empty can that rolled noisily down the sidewalk. "I can't believe this," he muttered to himself, anger bubbling in his chest. "That arrogant idiot. He didn't even give us a chance." Alva remained silent beside him, her eyes tracking the can's path until it stopped near a sewer grate. Her reaction to Emre Esposito's cruelty wasn't what Matteo expected. There were no tears, no visible anger. Instead, she seemed to have retreated even further into herself, into a place where mean words and looks couldn't reach her. Her world was made of notes, scales and harmonies, a refuge she had built since her father, an amateur musician, had given her that tenor saxophone a few years prior. "Are you okay, Alva?" Matteo asked, his voice softening. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she opened the saxophone case right there, on the dark sidewalk. The light from a street lamp glinted off the polished brass of the instrument, a golden glow amidst urban grit. With nimble, precise fingers, she assembled the mouthpiece, adjusted the reed, and brought the instrument to her lips. Matteo thought she would play, vent her frustration in the only language she completely mastered, but she didn't. She simply held the saxophone, her fingers poised over the keys, and closed her eyes. To an outside observer, she appeared frozen, but Matteo knew what was happening. She was playing in her head. An entire symphony, complex and soulful, was unfolding in her mind, a silent composition that was hers alone. Emre Esposito's cruelty hadn't broken her. It had merely given her a new theme for her music. The manager, meanwhile, had already forgotten the incident. He circulated among the tables, his fake smile firmly in place, ensuring his customers' wine glasses were always full, and their experiences were nothing short of perfect. "My apologies for the unpleasant interruption earlier," he said to Jacob Popescu's table. "Unfortunately, we have to deal with that sort of riffraff from time to time. It's the price of being in a prime location." Jacob nodded. "You did the right thing, Emre. Maintaining standards is everything." Their conversation was a distant hum to Iglesias, the jazz critic. He had finished his meal but couldn't shake the image of the girl and her saxophone from his mind. There was an authenticity about her, a gravity that starkly contrasted with the superficiality of the surroundings. He paid his bill and left, glancing down both sides of the street, hoping to find them, but they were already gone. Matteo's hunger was now a sharp ache. They wandered the streets, the weight of the saxophone and despair growing with each step. Every restaurant they passed seemed an impregnable fortress of warmth and food. The humiliation at La Lanterne Dorée had chipped away at Matteo's courage. He couldn't imagine going through that again. Underestimation was a constant in their lives. At school, teachers saw Alva as a problem to be managed, not a mind to be nurtured. Her classmates ignored her or, worse, mocked her silence and repetitive movements. No one saw what Matteo saw. The way her eyes lit up when she heard a complex John Coltrane passage. The way she could replicate any melody after hearing it just once. The passion that flowed from her when she played, transforming cold metal into an extension of her soul. The saxophone wasn't just a hobby. It was her voice, her translation of the chaotic world into something beautiful and ordered. Her father understood this. Music is the mathematics of the soul, Matteo, he used to say. For Alva, it's the only language that makes sense. Now, without him, Matteo struggled to protect that gift, to protect his sister in a world that had no patience for difference. The night deepened, and the cold intensified. They found temporary shelter in the doorway of a closed bookstore. Matteo took off his own coat and draped it over Alva's shoulders. He sat beside her, head in his hands, feeling the crushing weight of failure. He was the adult now, the protector, and he was failing miserably. It was then that Alva stirred. She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket that she had taken from a community notice board earlier that day. She unfolded it and handed it to Matteo. It was a simple pamphlet, printed in black and white. It advertised an open mic night at a small jazz bar across town, a place called the Blue Note Alley. Admission was free. The event started in an hour. Matteo looked at the flyer, then at Alva. Her eyes, for the first time that night, were focused on him, and in them was a spark of determination he hadn't seen in a long time. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't afraid. She was ready to fight in the only way she knew how, with her music. For a moment, as Matteo bowed his head in despair, he thought about giving up, about finding a shelter and perhaps reconsidering the social worker's dire suggestion. But his sister's gaze, the silent strength emanating from her, reignited something within him. What those privileged people like, Emre Esposito didn't know, was that every act of disdain was inadvertently writing its own sentence of defeat. Every humiliation only strengthened something within Alva that her oppressors couldn't see, a quiet force being fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose. If you believe that true talent always finds a way to shine, even in the deepest darkness, don't go anywhere. The setup for the most musical and satisfying comeback you've ever seen is about to begin. The Blue Note Alley was, the polar opposite of La Lanterne Dorée. Instead of bright lights and minimalist decor, the place was steeped in a cozy dimness, the air thick with the smell of beer, old wood, and jazz history. The walls were covered in yellowed posters of musical legends: Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, John Coltrane. There were no linen tablecloths, just wooden tables scarred by the glasses of countless patrons over the years. The stage was tiny, barely fitting a drum set, an upright piano, and a microphone. For Matteo, the place felt real, honest. For Alva, it felt like a sanctuary. As soon as they entered, she seemed to breathe deeper, as if the very air there was more nourishing. Sitting at a table in the back, nursing a cheap whiskey, was Yue Iglesias. The jazz critic, driven by an intuition that rarely failed him, had decided to skip his usual haunts and head to this humbler venue, hoping to catch a glimpse of the authenticity that was missing in more upscale establishments. When he saw Alva and Matteo enter, a subtle smile of satisfaction touched his lips. His intuition was right. The host for the evening, an older, weary musician named Henry Adeyemi, was on stage, announcing the next performer. "We've got room for one more tonight. Anyone want to show us what they've got?" The small audience, composed of a few music students, local musicians, and jazz lovers, remained silent. Nervousness seized Matteo. He leaned over to Alva. "Are you sure about this?" She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the empty stage. With a gentle nudge from Matteo, Alva walked towards the stage. Murmurs rippled through the small bar. People watched her with curiosity. Her youthful appearance, her simple clothes, and her detached expression didn't fit the stereotype of a confident jazz musician. Henry Adeyemi looked at her skeptically. "Do you have a name, sweetheart?" "Alva," she said, her voice so low it was barely audible. "And what will you be playing for us, Alva?" She didn't answer. She simply climbed the 2 steps to the stage, assembled her saxophone with practiced efficiency, and positioned herself near the microphone. The silence in the bar grew heavy, uncomfortable. Some in the audience exchanged glances, bracing for a disaster. Yue Iglesias, however, leaned forward in his chair, his attention fully focused. Then, Alva took a deep breath and played the first note. The sound that emerged from her saxophone was not that of a nervous amateur. It was a long, pure note, filled with a melancholy so profound the entire bar seemed to hold its breath collectively. The note sustained, vibrating in the air, before unfolding into a cascade of complex and moving sounds. She wasn't playing a known song. She was improvising. She was telling the story of that night, the hunger, the cold, the closed door, Emre Esposito's mocking laughter, the humiliation, her brother's despair. It was all there, translated into a universal language that everyone in the bar could understand, regardless of whether they knew her story or not. Her technique was flawless. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision that belied her age. But it wasn't the technique that captivated everyone. It was the raw emotion, the naked soul she was pouring through her instrument. The musical phrases were long and complex, filled with unexpected turns, alternating between whispered fury and lyrical sorrow. Yue Iglesias felt a shiver run down his spine. In his 30 years as a critic, he had heard the world's best musicians. He had dined with legends and seen prodigies rise and fade. But this was different. It was raw, untamed talent of an order he rarely encountered. It was the voice of someone who wasn't using music to entertain but to survive. When the last note faded into the stunned silence, no one applauded for a moment. The impact was too profound. Then, like a dam breaking, the bar erupted in applause and cheers. People were on their feet, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Henry Adeyemi, the host, looked at Alva with his mouth agape, skepticism replaced by pure reverence. Alva simply lowered her saxophone, her shoulders relaxing as if a great weight had been lifted from them. She didn't smile or bow. She simply turned and walked off the stage, returning to where Mateo waited for her, tears streaming down his face. Before they could think of leaving, Yue Iglesias was standing beside their table. That was, he began, searching for the right word. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. Mateo, still dazed, could only nod. "I'm Yue Iglesias," the critic said, "and I need to know your story." Over the next hour, seated at that wooden table, with plates of warm food and drinks that the bar's owner, Can Aziz, insisted they have on the house, Mateo told Yue everything: the death of their parents, the struggle to keep a roof over their heads, Alva's diagnosis, the eviction, and finally the humiliation at La Lanterne Dorée at the hands of Emre Esposito. Yue listened patiently, his gaze alternating between Mateo's passionate narrative and Alva's serene face as she ate silently. When Mateo finished, Yue was silent for a long moment, tapping his fingers on the table. "Emre Esposito is an arrogant snob," Yue said finally. "He represents everything that's wrong with the art world these days. The obsession with image over substance. He wouldn't recognize true talent even if it smacked him in the face." An idea began to form in the critic's mind. A plan. It wasn't revenge fueled by hate but by poetic justice. "People like Emre only understand one language," Yue continued. "Publicity. Image. What he did to you was in public. Your redemption, and his lesson, should be too." He leaned closer. "Alva, would you be willing to play again? But this time, for a much larger audience, right outside his door?" For a moment, as Alva accepted the challenge without protest, anyone might have thought they were witnessing just another failed attempt at confrontation, another different person being put in their place. But anyone watching closely Yue Iglesias's glinting eyes and Alva's silent determination would notice that it wasn't a confrontation being planned. It was a coronation. The stage was being set not in a dark bar but under the bright lights of injustice, and the world was about to discover that the prodigy they rejected was coming back to claim her throne. 2 days later, twilight painted the sky orange and purple over the city. The courtyard of La Lanterne Dorée was at its peak, filled with wealthy patrons enjoying their dinner. Emre Esposito oversaw it all with an air of satisfaction, adjusting a fork here, straightening a glass there. The order and exclusivity of his little kingdom were intact. He barely remembered the two young people he had chased away. To him, they were just a forgettable footnote in a busy day. He didn't notice a local news van parked discreetly across the street. He didn't notice Rena Vega, a young and ambitious journalist speaking in low tones to a cameraman. And he certainly didn't notice Yue Iglesias standing on the corner, speaking on his phone with calculated calm. "Yes, it's all set," Yue was saying. "Bring them, and tell them to keep an open mind. They are about to witness the birth of a star." Then, she arrived. Alva Szymanski-Baker, accompanied by Mateo, walked onto the sidewalk in front of the restaurant's courtyard. She didn't say a word. She simply opened her case, assembled her saxophone, and prepared herself. Mateo gave her an encouraging squeeze on the shoulder and stepped back, joining Yue and Rena Vega. Emre Esposito saw her. A flash of anger crossed his face. "Not again," he hissed to himself. He marched towards her, his face a mask of fury. "I thought I made myself clear. You are not welcome here. Leave now or I'll call the police." It was at that exact moment that Alva brought the instrument to her lips and began to play. The sound that emerged was so unexpected, so overwhelmingly beautiful, that Emre's words died in his throat. It was not the music of a beggar. It was the music of a master. She began with a soft, melancholic melody, a piece that seemed to carry the weight of all the loneliness in the world. The quality of the sound was pure, rich, and resonated down the street, cutting through the traffic noise. Inside the restaurant, conversations began to falter. Patrons turned in their chairs, seeking the source of that mesmerizing music. Jacob Popescu and Sofia Farhadi, the couple who had mocked her days before, paused with their forks in midair, their expressions of disdain morphing into confusion, and then admiration. Emre froze in place. His brain couldn't process the dissonance between the girl's appearance and the celestial sound she was producing. He looked around, desperate, and that's when his panic began. He saw the news camera pointed directly at him and Alva. He saw Yue Iglesias, the city's most feared and respected critic, watching the scene with a triumphant glint in his eye. And he saw a small crowd forming on the sidewalk, drawn by the music, their phones held aloft, recording. Alva's music shifted in tone. The melancholy gave way to an explosion of breathtaking technical complexity and energy. It was jazz in its purest form, improvisation, passion, and a story being told. It was a musical indictment, a declaration of her existence, undeniable proof of her worth. The notes soared and dipped, each phrase bolder and more brilliant than the last. People began to spill out of the restaurant, wine glasses in hand, to listen better. The sidewalk, once empty, was now thronged with silent, enchanted onlookers. Emre Esposito's world was crumbling in real time. The journalist, Rena Vega, approached Yue Iglesias, her microphone extended. "Mr. Iglesias, what are we witnessing here?" Yue's voice was clear and carried authority, projected to be heard by everyone around. "You are witnessing what happens when arrogance meets genius," he said, his gaze fixed on Emre. 2 days ago, the manager of this establishment, Mr. Emre Esposito, publicly humiliated this young musician, Alva Szymanski-Baker. He judged her by her appearance and refused to let her play for a plate of food. He called her street noise. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The faces of the restaurant's patrons contorted in shock and shame. They were complicit in his cruelty. Emre paled. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the courtyard lights. He took a step towards Alva, a desperate attempt to control the narrative. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. Young lady, please come inside. Play for my customers. I'll pay you whatever you want." But Alva ignored him. She was in her own world, lost in the music. The climax of her piece arrived, an explosion of high, powerful notes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was a sound of triumph, of overcoming, the soundtrack to a spirit that refused to be silenced. As the final note echoed and silence fell, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause and cheers. People were on their feet, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Alva lowered her saxophone, her chest heaving. She raised her eyes and for the first time looked directly at the crowd, at the camera, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Rena Vega approached Emre, her microphone now pointed at him. "Mr. Esposito, any comment on Mr. Iglesias's allegations?" Emre opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. There was nothing to say. The proof wasn't in documents or audio recordings. The proof was in the air, in the music that still hung heavy, in the genius he had scorned. He had built his empire on the perception of exclusivity and good taste, and in a single night, a silent teenager with an old saxophone had exposed his utter lack of both. He hadn't just made a misjudgment. He had committed professional suicide in broad daylight, at the center of that courtyard where discrimination disguised as tradition once reigned. A new reality now took shape, like a symphony finally finding its harmony after years of discordant notes, proving that true excellence knows no social class or limitations imposed by those who fear true greatness. As the masks fell, one question lingered in the air. Could bridges be built over such deep chasms of prejudice? The answer would come in the days that followed. But that night, justice was not whispered in a courtroom. It was blown through a saxophone for the whole world to hear. Alva's performance was not just local news. It became a viral sensation. The video recorded by Rena Vega's broadcast, titled "The Silent Saxophonist Who Silenced Arrogance," garnered millions of views in less than 24 hours. Social media exploded with the hashtag #CheerJusticeForAlva. People from all over the world shared the story, marveling at her talent and outraged by the treatment she received. For La Lanterne Dorée, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The restaurant's reservation website was flooded with cancellations. Review pages were bombarded with one-star critiques, detailing Emre Esposito's cruel behavior. Comments like, "Luxury food with inhumane service," and "I'd rather eat on the street than fund a place that humiliates the needy," became the norm. Emre desperately attempted damage control. He issued a public statement full of cliches, speaking of an unfortunate misunderstanding and offering a generous donation to a music charity. No one believed him. His attempt at redemption sounded as hollow as his restaurant, which within a week went from being the hottest spot in town to a silent mausoleum. The restaurant's owners, an anonymous conglomerate of investors, acted swiftly to distance themselves from the public relations disaster. Emre Esposito was summarily fired. The man who prided himself on being the guardian of good taste was publicly disgraced, his career in ruins. He became a pariah in the industry he so valued, a cautionary tale of what happens when hubris blinds humanity. As Emre's empire crumbled, Alva and Mateo's world transformed. Iglesias's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Record labels, festival producers, philanthropists, and prestigious music schools all wanted a piece of Alva. She was no longer an anonymous beggar. She was a discovered prodigy, a symbol of hope and the triumph of talent over prejudice. Yue, acting as mentor and protector, filtered the offers, ensuring Alva would not be exploited. With the help of a lawyer who offered to work pro bono, they established a fund for Alva. Donations poured in. Within weeks, they had enough money for not only a safe and comfortable apartment, but also to secure Alva's future and Mateo's education. The most significant change, however, was in Alva. With the validation of her talent and a safe environment, she began to flourish. Although still a person of few words, her music became her primary voice. She began composing, creating pieces that were both technically brilliant and emotionally profound. She accepted a full scholarship to the country's most prestigious music academy, where professors didn't see her as a student with difficulties, but as an artist with a unique perspective. Mateo also found his path. Free from the crushing burden of being the sole provider and protector, he was finally able to enroll in community college to study social work, inspired to help others who, like them, had fallen through the cracks of the system. The community of the Blue Note Alley, the little bar that had given them their first chance, also benefited. It became a pilgrimage site for Alva's fans, packed every night. Alva, in a gesture of gratitude, made surprise appearances on the tiny stage where it all began, never forgetting the kindness shown to her in the darkness. 6 months later, Alva Szymanski-Baker stood on the stage of the International Jazz Festival, not as a curiosity act, but as the headliner. The spotlight shone on her saxophone, the same worn instrument she had held that cold night in front of La Lanterne Dorée. The audience of thousands fell into absolute silence as she began to play. The music she played was one of her new compositions. It was a piece that told a story. It began with low, hesitant notes, full of uncertainty and pain. Slowly, the melody gained strength, weaving a narrative of resilience and struggle. The music swelled in intensity, exploding into a crescendo of power and joy, a celebration of overcoming. In the wings, Mateo watched with tears in his eyes, standing next to Yue Iglesias. They saw the quiet girl transform into a musical giant, commanding the world's attention with nothing but her breath and her soul. Emre Esposito had tried to destroy Alva with mockery and disdain, but he had ended up destroying himself. Alva and Mateo learned that true justice isn't about reciprocating the harm suffered. It's about building a future so bright that the shadows of the past have no power over it. Their story teaches us a powerful lesson. Never underestimate anyone. A person's true worth isn't in their appearance or how they fit our expectations, but in the passion and talent they carry within. And you, what would you have done in Emre's or Alva's place? Let us know in the comments if you have ever witnessed an act of prejudice and how it made you feel. If this story of triumph has touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice that prove that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest music to play.